Hello, everyone. I'm pretty taken by the pictures you just showed. It's I'm very privileged to be with you actually today, because if anything has been shown in COVID now is how much communities matter. Sometimes taking it away kind of makes you know how important it is to the social resilience and the resilience of people. So I'm very grateful to be with you, and congratulations on all the work you keep on doing despite these difficult times. So, um, my intervention will be a bit because we had a conversation around kind of how do you manage now actually in this state. I mean the situation is quite difficult, and I know it's difficult for many of you that your operations are being challenged, what you're doing is being challenged, your membership, etc. And so, of course, we had this COVID-19 that kind of created this huge shock, and that was already kind of on the on the background of big change happening and a lot of uncertainty in terms of the automation, for example, the future of work, as you all know, like the international the international geopolitics changing, income inequality increasing. So it's kind of that there's been over the last years, and now certainly like these huge sense of uncertainty taking us and making our lives very difficult to make any type of decisions. And so what we tend to do in those type of situations is quite logically like either freeze or have knee-jerk reactions very often. It's really hard to manage, and we tend to worry a lot. Of course, as you know, there's a lot of mental health issues, but we can also just look at ourselves as leaders of organizations and as advisors. It's not very easy to kind of not worry, right? The way we usually engage in these situations about with the future is to just worry what can happen, and kind of lose a bit the strategic edge. And so what I wanted to talk to you about is maybe quickly, because we have very limited time, obviously, like to give you a bit of an alternative that you might want to explore. So, and that's called strategic foresight. So I will very quickly just run you through kind of what it is and a little process that you could be doing within your organization to make it quite practical. So what is strategic foresight and the use of scenario planning? It's actually the way I look at it is it's a way to productively engage with the future. It's kind of to think about what might happen. What are some of those scenarios that matter to you that might occur? And how do you bring that still into your today's decision making? How do you get empowered to still make decisions despite all the uncertainty? How do you bring it in? And so it's kind of a powerful sense-making tool. So the way we the way I'm thinking about it is really as part of your strategy process, right? You will all probably have to rethink a bit what your strategies are in the future. And so as any type of strategy process, kind of the first thing you do is obviously look at your vision and your mission, kind of, what is this eternal long-term goal that we're trying to achieve? And for you, that's obviously empowering young people to create better communities and a better future. If I may summarize it like that. From there on, in a strategy process, you go and think about like, how do we get there, right? Kind of, what is my strategic plan? What are my strategic options, your priorities, etc. Before then going on to a process of defining your agency, kind of what's the action plan, who needs to do what, when, and what type of capabilities do we need to build up to achieve that. Now, this is kind of normal strategy process. What we're suggesting is in times of uncertainty like this is really to bring kind of foresight and exploration of different futures and different scenarios in that. Because what it will allow you to do is to get kind of a better assessment of how likely it is, or what are some of those main blocks you might occur while you're trying to achieve your goal. It will also help you define kind of the options, your strategic options you have while you're to achieve that goal. Maybe there's some things that are not possible anymore, options that have been closed down because you end up in a certain situation, that circumstances that don't allow you to exercise those options or those activities or those things you're doing, or those business models, but maybe other options might open up. So it's really a reflection on how do we go about that now. In a very, I have put here, but that will be, I suppose, circulated afterwards. I've put kind of a little, steps approach into that. So what I would suggest is that one of the ways you can work with this is maybe just within your organizations, look, first of all, step one, clarify be very clear about your goals. So if you have to redo your strategy now, think about what your goals are. You can do it for, of course, the big goal of keeping young people engaged and keeping them empowered, but your goal for the moment might also just be to kind of survive, right? To economically survive. And kind of that is what you would be looking at. And then you really start to look at what type of futures we might face, develop those scenarios. There's different methods and ways of doing that, but in general, what people do, your tendency will be, of course, to look at the scenario. First one you look at is kind of your projection, a forecast, an expected future. So which means that you will be looking at a future that is kind of a little bit looking at the past. Some people are looking at, will we go back to the pre-COVID, right? That can be one of the scenarios. What will we do if we? I don't think that's a very good scenario to take into account, because I don't think that's where the world. There's any chance that the world would go back to where we were pre-COVID, but of course you can take into account some of those trends that are happening and do some projections. And why we do this, why we try to imagine that future, to project and to forecast that future, is because it recreates that kind of sense of certainty, right? Once we know again kind of what the future is, when we can make an assessment about that, then we can make more easily decisions, of course. But the problem is that in a situation like this one, as you know, we're living in high uncertainty, in genuine uncertainty. It's not that people are not smart enough, there's not enough resources. It just is genuinely uncertain where the world is going, and it's extremely complex. In those type of worlds, you really have to work with scenarios, and you cannot just bang your strategy, to say so, on kind of an expected future and hope things will work out the way you're thinking they might work out. So you have to really make sure that you think about everything which is disruptive, all the bad scenarios, the dire scenarios that might happen, so that you can kind of rehearse that if these features happen, what would you be doing? So you can avoid knee-jerk reactions. So you might want to go through thinking about what are some of those high impact change factors. So what are some of those things that are changing that are relevant for our context? And do we know where they go or not? For example, in this COVID area, we know that certain things are changing, and we know some directionality of it. So we know there is increasing inequality. We know that the gender inequality will increase. We know that there is the mental health issues are increasing. So we know that on average wages will go down. So there's a couple of things like that the economic opportunity for young people is highly likely to go down in the future. Because of the whole situation, not only COVID, but also the other trends we were talking about, as automation, etc. And so we know there's certain things in the future that will be problematic for organizations potentially, like yourself, or the clients that you're serving, the people that you're serving. On the other side, we also have to look at some of the major uncertainties. We need to take those into account. One of the major uncertainties, obviously, in COVID is if, when, and how will we control COVID? There is, of course, we just heard the talk in one of the breakouts about the Russian vaccine. There's a lot of vaccines but being tested, but ultimately there's none for the moment. We will also not know that when there is a vaccine, if there is a treatment, who will own it, and so given the geopolitics, kind of who will have access to it, and etc. So there's a lot of unknowns around this. There's a lot of unknowns about the shape of the economic recovery. There is kind of a big narrative still out there that we will go through some kind of a V-shaped economic recovery, going down and then kind of coming up kind of nearly to where we were before. That is more fed by looking at what happens at the capital markets, which is kind of a bit disconnected from the reality of the economy. There's a lot of uncertainties about what jobs might disappear, change, or bloom in the future, which matters to the people you're serving also. There's a lot of uncertainty about how much government support will be available. For the moment, we call, we say that the economies are on kind of life support. When will that life support, diminish? Where will that go? A lot of uncertainty, which is relevant for you too, is the generational divide. The young people are feeling, and it's not just a feeling, that they have less economic opportunity, that some of their assets might become less valuable in the future, etc. The young people are giving up a lot for older people's health. I'm just translating what I'm hearing, not necessarily agreeing. But there's a lot of that going on. And so if we look at all kinds of these different things that are changing the world in which we're walking into, it would be interesting to kind of look at how things might play out and ask yourself, so what if X, Y, and Z are happening in the future? What does that actually mean for us? And really also try to look at some of these very dire, uncomfortable scenarios, because it's much better to be prepared for them than to not be prepared and happen in that situation and then have to have knee-jerk reactions. So of course, once you have explored all these futures, it's kind of nice, but what do you do with it? Very often we hear, right, now you give me all these different futures, and how do I know which one is happening and which not? So you have to kind of start planning for all of them. So you have to start looking at all these different scenarios and identify what are the implications for you. And implications might show up in terms of your access to certain markets, in terms of like the type of activities that you can be proposing, your operating costs, your need to maybe invest in alternative distribution models, etc. So you have to wonder about, if these different worlds come about, what does it really mean for us, YMCA, or my local country, YMCA? And then these assumptions, actually, you have to compare them to your planning assumptions that you've been using over the past. So very often when we do strategy, we all have planning assumptions. They're not always explicit. So just writing them down explicitly, but what were we supposing about the future when we made our plans? What made our plans made sense based on what we were thinking? And then kind of compare what we were thinking to other things that might happen, the implications of the different scenarios. You have to kind of sort them then in, okay, those ones seems to be reasonable and still hold in the future, so we can let our planning be guided by that. Then there's others, maybe we made some assumptions that, the world is very unlikely to end up in that way. So we have to kind of review these assumptions and adapt our decisions on the basis of that. And so once you have done that, kind of really looking at the future, what you thought the future would be, your assumptions with kind of the future that you have explored now and how these assumptions might have to be reviewed. Once you have done that work, then you can start to review kind of your strategic planning. What are your options? What are your plans? What do you need to stop doing, start doing, change, etc. And then start, of course, to be adaptive. You have to monitor. You have to see kind of which of those futures that we've been exploring is actually more likely to happen. Which future are we walking into? And so it's a relatively simple a process that you could start running within your organizations, because you're doing planning anyway and you're looking at the future already anyway, and maybe it's just helpful to make it a bit structured and really take the quality time that you need to have these type of reflections, so that you can feel kind of empowered, to take the decisions in these very difficult times. And so I will just leave it there, and I hope that just like this practice of strategic foresight, of intentional structured thinking about the future and bringing it back into decision making can kind of help you, those who would be kind of a bit in panic mode or in worry mode, can hopefully help a bit. I hope that's a little bit of guidance that can be helpful. I will leave it there, and I'm open to any type of questions, of course, or comments.
Thank you very much, Kristel. Thank you for the presentation. I hope our Spanish speaker were able to follow to the translation. Thank you to Antonio. So we're going to open for 5-minute question. But Kristel, can you tell us who are your normal clients? Who do you work with generally? Because we know this is a skill that we are looking for in the civil society. But who are your clients generally?
Well, at present, my biggest client is my near to full-time job, which is I'm the Director General of Policy Horizons Canada, so which is the strategic foresight unit of the federal government of Canada. I'm also working a lot on this type of capacity building. I was a consultant also for 3 years, and I still am before doing this like more permanently. I work a lot with the European Commission on getting them the skills that they need and the capacity to do this type of work. I worked with a lot of clients. You know, I used to live in Geneva as yourself, Mr. Sanvi. So I work with a lot of international organizations that are present there to help them really start to connect with some of those complicated futures they might be facing. So it is very heavily practiced within governments more and more. It is very heavily, there's great demand for building up those type of skills in the international non-profit or international institutions world. And it is a lot practiced, but that you would never see publicly, obviously, in companies as part of their strategy processes. But there is great demand for this, of course, like to learn how to do it. And it is something, you know, very often people say like, oh, do you need to, you know, to study for this for like years, etc. My answer is always no, because we always do strategic foresight. Each one of you does strategic foresight implicitly all the time. What you have to learn is to do it more consciously and more structured. And there's methods and tools that you can do, but we all think about the future all the time. We just need to make it more structured.
Thank you. So I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we can see you more. There is a question here. I will invite Peter to ask the question. And if there are other questions, please put it on the chat, and we might not be able to answer all those questions. But Peter, do you want to raise your question?
Yes, thanks, Carlos, and thanks for the presentation, Kristel. It was very helpful. When you think about scenario planning, you're trying to project out in a very calm and rational place the potential futures that you face, and none of us could have predicted a global pandemic or COVID. Well, maybe you see you shaking your head. Maybe you did. I didn't predict a global pandemic or COVID impacting our YMCA's, but I'm curious about, you know, any advice you have in being agile and being responsive in doing scenario planning very quickly and changing it, because you do say monitor and reevaluate. Can you talk about that process a little bit? Because that feels like the space that we're in right now. We did some initial moves and we're trying to be contemplative, but to really be effective, we have to be agile as well. So I wonder if you have any advice there.
Yeah. Well, on the pandemic, I was just shaking my head because a lot of people have actually said it would come. It's just like, you know, it's such a futures that are seen as being, you know, maybe not on my term or too discomfortable, or you don't have really a solution to it. They tend to be kind of qualified as risks, and we just put them away somewhere because we don't want to talk about it. It's too complicated to deal with. So this pandemic is one of those examples. Like everyone knew this was coming at some point. We had to prepare and no one did because it's so big. But that being said, if you want to do something quick with your teams, for example, or just in your organization, one of the things you could just do is look now at all the planning assumptions you're making, right? You put your teams together and you just make a list of the things that you think are true about the future and that are really important to you. So what are some of those driving forces? Whether how they play out matters significantly to you. And you just list those. And then you go and look one by one, whether they make sense or not. So if you assume that there's going to be a vaccine in the next 12 months and you have enough money in your bank to kind of survive for the next 12 months, but if that doesn't happen, that vaccine, and then you would go bankrupt after 12 months, that's probably a big thing, right? That's a big uncertainty you have to watch for. And you need to find kind of a plan for that. If you're wrong, if it's not within the next 12 months, but it's longer, how would you start to react on that? So you see, you just start by just making explicit your planning assumptions that really matter, and that if they're not true, you're in trouble. Whether it is in your finance, in the fact that you actually deliver value, in being able to connect with your community and your members, just list. Usually there are not that many of them. There's like maybe 5, 6 that really can make you go under, right? And then you have to think, like, if it happens differently, then what would be really nice? If the world turns out to be different than the one that I would love to see, what am I going to do? And then it's either things that you can start investing now, or there are different skills you need to create, or there are different service offerings you can start to put in place that would, you know, be robust to a world like that. Or so can you start preparing? What can you start doing now to prepare for that future, even if it's not sure which one is happening? So if you start to move certain of your community building things online, for example, instead of doing it in person, that's not a waste. You know, if the world happens to have a vaccine in 12 months, that's not a waste, because you know, then whatever is digital, you can even share across different countries and kind of optimize. So really make those assumptions. What is making you go under? Potentially, if it turns out to be different than it is, and prepare for that, I would say.
Well, and good luck moving forward.